Tov, everybody. It's been very sweet and very welcomed Shabbat here in Zurich, so thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed being with you. So, as was mentioned, tomorrow night is Hanukkah, a holiday that, for a different time, we can talk about, a holiday that's actually had enormous evolutions in Jewish history, and I would argue has probably become most important in Jewish history in the past century. There's a lot of good indications that Hanukkah was important for a long time to Jews, but has become really important to Jews in the 20th century, partly having to do with the creation of the State of Israel. Hanukkah is tailor-made as a national story of Jewish cultural and national revival within the land of Israel, and has produced, as people know, tremendous new songs and literature and poetry. It's a very popular holiday in Israel, and it plays very well, unlike Yom Kippur, to religious and secular alike. So there's been a new revival of Hanukkah in that sense in the State of Israel, and has also found, at least in my experience as an American Jew, a kind of revival among American Jews for no other reason than the fact that it comes around the same time as Christmas. So for a Jewish community that's looking for a way to participate through the process of assimilation in a broader culture, and to also have our own holidays, if we have Hanukkah, it enables other people to say to us, happy holidays. And I can say it back to somebody else as well. It's very ecumenically designed. In that context, there are so many different aspects of the Hanukkah story. Earlier today I spoke a little bit about assimilation as being one of those stories. But one of the stories that I wanted to pick up on tonight, which I think is not only an interesting component of the Hanukkah story that needs to be expounded on, but also has a lot of, it's very politically suggestive for the current moment, especially when we imagine Hanukkah as celebrated within a national and sovereign context in Israel. And that is the ways in which violence, and in some ways political violence, features as a central dimension of the Hanukkah story. I say that acknowledging that if you would only read what rabbinic tradition has to say about Hanukkah, it's not violent at all. In the Al Hanisim prayer, which we say during the Amidah during Birkat HaMazon throughout the week of Hanukkah, you have the depiction of the Jewish people as being the weak and vulnerable party who managed to kind of get on the right side and defeat the powerful Greek army. And in the rabbinic tradition, there's very, very little in all of the Talmud about Hanukkah. It doesn't have its own tractate of Talmud. You get one short piece which we'll look at, and famously, rabbinic tradition makes a lot less about the war of Hanukkah and a lot more about the miracle of the candles, the miracle of the lights. So it's not really that violent of a holiday, but it masks the fact that underneath this moment of reconsecrating the Beit HaMikdash is actually a violent war that takes place between the Jews and the Greeks. Or more importantly, there's a violent battle that takes place between different types of Jews. We could go into depth about all of the ethnic makeup of Judea in the 2nd century before the Common Era, but the real issue that's being negotiated at Hanukkah is not quite the same story that we get 2 centuries later, where there's the Roman army and the Jewish people. We actually have a more complicated battle that's taking place between Jews who are on the side of one form of assimilation and Jews who are on a different side as relates to assimilation. And that is evidenced in at least one of the traditions that is essential to Hanukkah. So I wanted to read that with you tonight. It's the story of Hanukkah as it's told in the first book of Maccabees, the 2nd chapter of the first book of Maccabees. How many, by the way, just so we know, how many people have read the book of Maccabees? I got a handful, or maybe excerpts, or I know about its existence, right? I know about its existence, I know it's there. I want to read this chapter because it's an extraordinary piece of literature, and to notice the ways that it has kind of disappeared from the canonical tradition about Hanukkah. What we're then going to do tonight is, the rabbis don't talk about this at all, but they talk a lot about things like this. So I'm not going to argue that Chazal, that the sages are directly responding to the story of Hanukkah as it's told in the book of Maccabees, but if the story from the book of Maccabees has all of these ethical lessons and components, the rabbis have a lot of opinions about that. They have a tremendous amount of opinions on zeal in the pursuit of political violence. What would people do if you believe that what you were doing was obeying God's command? Right? Does that allow me? Does that entitle me to take justice into my own hands? The rabbis have a lot of strong opinions about that. And tonight I want to unpack both of those stories and then near the end discuss what the ramifications of this are for the way we think about both Hanukkah and political violence as Jews today. So that's what I'm hoping to do. The story from the book of Maccabees, we're going to read a lot of this, even though it's a long chapter. It's a 70-verse chapter. Pretty good. There's very few of those actually in the Torah. The book of Maccabees, for those who are unfamiliar, is a book of Jewish literature from the 2nd century BCE. So it's written approximately within probably a half a century of when the Maccabean revolt actually takes place. It is probably written originally in Hebrew. We only have evidence of it in Greek. So we know it's probably Hebrew because there seemed to be a whole bunch of stuff in there that looks translated into Greek, but it only comes to us in the context of Greek through the Septuagint and other Second Temple literature, which means it gets preserved by other ancient Jews, but not the ones who wind up canonizing the Torah. So it is probably known to the people who put together what we ultimately know as Tanakh. It is probably known to Chazal as a book that's out there, and you have to ask, are they making an intentional choice to exclude it or not? It does appear in the Apocrypha of the New Testament. So in a number of different Christian churches, it's considered actually part of the lectionary tradition, and it's read at certain times of the year. And we can unpack all of the ramifications of what it means that the church preserves this, but Jews don't. So, and it also, for us as Jews, it's a powerful thing to say, there are pieces of our own history that would not be known to us were it not for the church wanting their version of Judaism to continue into history. They have a version of Judaism that they want to tell. Our ancestors didn't want to preserve that story, but it actually is really important to fleshing out the story and the traditions from which we come as well. And there's other pieces of that history as well. Okay, so we're in the second chapter of the book of Maccabees. The first chapter had told the entire story of the Greek arrival into the land of Israel, largely through the conquest of Alexander the Great. Just as one other piece of context, the rabbis have commentary about Alexander the Great. They like him. Chazal likes Alexander the Great. There's wonderful pieces of Talmud about welcoming Alexander the Great to Jerusalem, because he didn't come in as a conquering hero in quite the same way, and then things go bad. That's, by the way, a pretty famous sequence in Jewish history. We like the original rulers, and then within 150 years later, not so much the people who come after them. No political commentary implied in that context. There will be a political commentary later. They like Alexander the Great. It's pretty clear that by the time we're talking about the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BCE, we're less keen on that story, right? They're never as good as the ancestors. And so now, the king's officers are enforcing the fact that they're enforcing a ban or a prohibition on Jewish behaviors and practices. Historians debate extensively whether or not there were such bans, how severe they were. Nevertheless, the book of Maccabees assumes that there are bans that have been instituted on Jewish practices. Some of the most famous bans that get talked about are keeping Shabbat or circumcising children. That recurs at multiple different revolutionary moments in Jewish history. And this is the story that happens when the king's officers are traveling around the countryside, forcing Jews to do the opposite of what Jews want to do. Text says as follows: the king's officers who were enforcing the apostasy came to the town of Modi'in to make them offer sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Matthias and his sons were assembled. Okay, so they come to this town of Modi'in. Modi'in, if I know that a lot of people in this community go to Israel, there's just great Hasmonean stuff around Modi'in. In fact, one of the towns around Modi'in is called Hashmonaim. This is like the headquarters of the Maccabean revolt. The king's officer said to Matityahu as follows: "You are a leader, honored and great in this town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now, be the first to come and do what the king commands, as all of the Gentiles and the people of Judah and those that are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts." It's a good political strategy. Find the popular people, get them to do this, and then everybody will follow them. But Matityahu answered and said in a loud voice, Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning the religion of our ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left. That last line is probably a paraphrase of the Torah, right? Lo tasur yaminu small. So Matityahu speaks not only a pious language of resistance, but it's a coded language of we are the people who obey the Torah as opposed to obeying the king's command. When he had finished speaking these words, this is going to be the crux, this paragraph is the crux of the whole thing. When he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modi'in according to the king's command. We don't know who this Jew is, we're not told. I wish I knew, right? A great villain of Jewish history, whose name goes unmentioned. When Matityahu saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to righteous anger. He ran and killed him on the altar. This is amazing, and we're going to come back to this theme. Altars are sacrifices of death to begin with. If anything that goes on an altar is getting killed in order to be put on the altar. So killing somebody on an altar is, on one hand, an act of desecration. On the other hand, it's an act of consecration. Both things happen at the same time. Anything that goes on an altar is sacrificed. At the same time, he killed the king's officer, who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he burned with zeal for the law, just as Pinchas did against Zimri, son of Salu. That's very important, right? Now, by the way, this is one of these things that, you kind of wish the authors of the Book of Maccabees hadn't said explicitly, because then we would just know it's a midrash. The whole thing is a midrash on the story of Pinchas. But when they tell you that it's imitating Pinchas, it kind of gives away the fun part. And you kind of wonder whether, had they not given it away, maybe it fits better into the tradition, because it does what oftentimes later books of Tanakh do, which is that they make coded references to earlier books of Tanakh as forms of commentary, but they don't tell you that they're doing it. This is just giving away too much of the plot to say, just as Pinchas had done. Then Matityahu cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant come out with me." Who is this now? That's not Pinchas. Which story is that channeling from the Torah? Not Shmuel. Not Eliyahu Navi.
No.
It's Moshe. In the midst of the plague, right? Moshe. It's part of the same story, but it takes place later on. When Moshe says, in the middle of the camp, the plague is taking place, and says, Mila Hashem Elai. And by the way, that in and of itself is a fascinating religious posture. It's not, if you have to self-identify to be part of the good, lest you be interpreted part of the bad. This gains political currency when President Bush, after 9/11, says, either you're with us or you're with the terrorists. He says that famously in U.S. Congress. You have to self-identify as part of the good, otherwise you render yourself vulnerable for us to kill you. Right? So Matityahu channels Moshe. He's not just channeling Pinchas, he channels Moshe in this moment. And then he and his sons fled to his hills and left all that they had in town. We're going to do 2 more paragraphs. I'll pause for a second for any questions about this text, and then we'll go on. At that time, there were many who were seeking righteousness and justice, went down to the wilderness to live there. So people flock to Matityahu to come be part of his team. They and their sons and wives and livestock, because troubles pressed heavily upon them. And it was reported to the king's officers and to the troops in Jerusalem, in the city of David, that those who had rejected the king's command had gone down to the hiding places in the wilderness. Many pursued them and overtook them. They encamped opposite them and prepared for battle against them on the Sabbath day. This is a problem. They said to them, "Enough of this. Come out and do what the king's commands, and you will live." But they said, "We will not come out, nor will we do as the king commands, and so profane the Sabbath day." Not only we don't want to come out to give up against you, but even leaving our places right now is a violation of Shabbos. So we can't do anything right now. Then the enemy quickly attacked them. They didn't answer them or hurl on others. Historians don't know whether that's exactly right, but there's no reason not to believe it. Hasmoneans become strong kings, And by the time they expand the boundaries of the Hasmonean Empire, right, well beyond the boundaries of the land of Israel, they're described as conquering other people and forcibly circumcising them to make them part of some way of the polity of Israel. Violence in service of piety very, very rarely stays closed in one place. It becomes a behavior, it becomes a habit. Any questions or comments so far on this text that we've seen or pieces that you picked up on?
Not on the text, but you didn't mention with regard to violence in the Torah. Isn't it violence when the Leviim, after the Chet HaEgel, that the Leviim kill?
That's the Milah. I think that's Milah Shamelai.
Yeah.
I think that's Milah Shamelai. Is that moment?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's this one. Yeah.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned only Pinchas
Yes,
was the
right,
only.
that's right. That's right. After the Chet HaEgel. That's right. Other comments or questions on this?
Yeah. You talked about the fact that the Chazal, the Talmud, doesn't say much about the Maccabee. I heard an interpretation that, of course, Talmud was written much later, and they saw the decadence of the Maccabee dynasty, and that's why they wanted to keep a distance.
This is always a problem for historians to say, it's the problem that's called evidence from absence.
No.
If somebody doesn't talk about something, is that proof that they're not saying something?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to prove, right? So I'm in an argument right now, literally, yesterday afternoon and tonight with somebody on Twitter on exactly this question, who insists Chazal didn't know about the Maccabees. He says the fact that they say very little about them is because they probably don't know a lot about them. I don't agree. I'm with you. I think they don't like them.
Yeah.
Right? But neither of us can prove the point because
sure.
I can point to the 5 or 6 small things that they say about them and stitch them together and say, look, they don't say much about them. And by the way, they wind up inventing a totally different Hanukkah, which is about spiritual renewal of the Jewish people. But meanwhile, the other argument has to its advantage that I have no data, and very little data. So they say instead of making that claim, they want to make a much more narrow argument. Go ahead.
The Hasmoneans started with self-defense. Do you find self-defense also as violence?
So that's a great question, right? So the Hasmoneans define this as self-defense, although it's not it's not quite self-defense. It's more like violence to prevent being forced to do something religiously.
That's self-defense.
Okay, so now we have an interesting question, right? Self-defense is traditionally defined as someone who does an act of violence towards you. This is persecution. So they are clearly operating at the beginning of this story through a framework of self-defense, right? Even using your definition. By the end of the story, it's not clear that they're in the realm of self-defense anymore. They're establishing now the parameters of their own theocratic state. We remember when we didn't hold this tightly, we experienced this persecution, and they wind up pushing that envelope. This is always the dynamic around questions of self-defense. This is always the question. For traditional Jewish literature, you can make a very, very strong argument that the Torah, unlike Christian morality, there's a very big distinction between rabbinic morality and Christian morality on this. Rabbinic morality very clearly believes that there is a moral, not only necessity, but fundamental legitimacy to the right to defend oneself. Right? Based on Haba lahorgecha, hashkem lahorgo, someone comes to kill you, you can preempt them. And that turns into actually a lot of Talmudic texts that make that case much more explicit. Christian morality, largely rooted in the Gospels, remember Jesus is said to have said, if someone strikes you, give him the other cheek. Right? Don't actually engage with that form of resistance. Paradoxically, Christianity became very powerful and didn't adhere much to its principles. Right? Whereas rabbinic tradition spent the next 2,000 years vulnerable and very rarely capable of coming to our own self-defense. The question is not, is there a fundamental morality to self-defense? Everybody would say yes. The question is, does the commitment to that self-defense start to turn into something else? What happens when someone has an ideology of self-defense and then becomes powerful? Does everything around you then become an existential threat? Right? Do you start to use that language of power in a very different way. And the other ancient story that we have that comes closest to the Hanukkah story in this way, but does make it into Tanakh, is the Purim story. Strangely, by the way, Hanukkah should be in and Purim not. There's a lot of problems in the Purim story, one of which is that God's not there and there's a lot of drinking and sex. But the same thing happens in the book of Esther, where the Jewish people are vulnerable up until chapter 7, and by chapter 9, the Jews are powerful and they continue to go on a killing spree. So this is a weird thing that these stories are already signaling to us, is how long does the claim of self-defense get to be made before it actually turns into something else? Yeah, go ahead.
I have another question. Basic to rabbinic tradition is that Pikuach Nefesh is Dochet Kol HaTorah Kula. They didn't know about this? Why didn't they fight on Shabbos?
Great question. Did they not know it? Did they not know it to be the case? I don't know.
Well, they didn't know the Gemara.
This is an old tradition. I don't think this was invented later on.
It's a great question. Anything else? Any others? So let's go back into this text that's being cited here, which is the story of Pinchas. And I want to flag, I assume folks mostly know the story of Pinchas, which is this moment of great zealotry when Pinchas witnesses, as we'll see, we'll just read it. When Israel is living in Shittim, dwelling in Shittim, the people began to play the harlot with the daughters of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifices of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. And so Israel had attached itself to Baal Peor. Right? That's what happened. The consequence of, it starts with mixed dancing, and then they're committing idolatry, and now they've completely attached themselves to Baal Peor. And the anger of God was kindled against Israel. Now this is the key line, is line 4. The Lord said to Moses, "Take all of the chiefs of Israel and hang them in the sun before the Lord, so that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel." There's a very clear directive that God gives to Moshe, which is to hang on spears the chiefs of Baal Peor. This is the line in the story that is most often missed. Because Pinchas is seen as doing something unusual, he's actually just the only person who follows the instructions. Right? So at Moses now says to the judges of Israel, "Every one of you slay his men who have yoked himself to Baal Peor." Well, that's not what God had said. Moshe changes the instructions. What God had instructed was focus on the leaders. By the way, that was in the Maccabee story also. Focus on the leaders and make a public display of them. And do that with a very specific way of killing, which is spearing them and holding them out to the sun. Crucifixion goes way before the Romans. It's an old form of using punishment as a means of public deterrence. So God had given this specific instruction, and Moshe gave a different and actually worse instruction, which is kill everybody. And in this moment of uncertainty, the following happens. Behold, one of the people of Israel came and brought a Midianite woman to his family, in the sight of Moses, in the sight of all his congregation, the people of Israel, while they were weeping at the door of the tent of meeting. So what's actually happening to the people of Israel?
Nothing.
They seem kind of powerless. Moses and the congregation are standing there weeping. They have direct instructions, which they're not doing. And in that vacuum of leadership and power, this one of the people of Israel brings a Midianite woman, and then when Pinchas, the son of Eleazar, saw it, he rose and left the congregation, took a spear in his hand, and went after the man of Israel into the inner room, and pierced both of them, the man of Israel and the woman, through her body, and thus the plague was stayed from the people of Israel. Nevertheless, 24,000 people had died, and then you get the blessing. Pinchas ben Eleazar turned my wrath away from the people of Israel, for he was jealous, bekanoet kinati b'tocham, so that I did not consume the people of Israel in my jealousy. The plague ceases immediately. Why does the plague cease immediately? Because they follow the direct divine instructions. I don't need you to go kill everybody. All I need you to do is one act of violence, which will signal, right, that this is now unacceptable in God's eyes, and it will have the effect, which it seems to do socially and politically, it will have the effect it needs to have. It is I would say, a strategic use of violence. Not a comprehensive use of violence, but a strategic use of violence. Pinchas is understood to be anomalous and strange through this phrase, B'kan'o et kinati. He acts zealously on behalf of God. But it's another way to say it is Pinchas acts literally at the answer. So the only thing that makes Pinchas unusual is that in a moment when other people are processing and thinking, how do I do this? Should I do it? You give somebody a clear instruction. Whatever's happened to you, and they come back to you with a whole bunch of questions. That's what happens here. There's a clear instruction, and the only thing that seems to make Pinchas unusual is that he acts quickly and without thinking, which is very useful. Go ahead, sorry.
It's not the instruction.
Why not?
Because he goes to it's not the Roshei Ha'am, it's this guy who's going with the Midianite. It's not the Roshei Ha'am.
Yeah, no, he was a Rosh
He is, because if you look down at the
Rosh Mishpacha. Yeah.
if you look down at verse 14, the name of Shema Isha Yisrael Mukash Sherukat Midianit Zimri ben Salu Nasi Beit Av Lashimoni. Yeah, it doesn't. You're right. It doesn't mention it right away, but it does later. And not only is it that, but she's a Beit Av Midianit. So it's like a perfect way. They become a perfect illustration, right? And they, in fact, it's almost like they stepping into this moment gives opportunity to the people to actually fulfill God's instruction to them. So that's it becomes but Pinchas represents the ability, the piety of acting quickly and decisively to commit this act of violence, which then exonerates the responsibility of having to perform a lot more violence. This is in essence the kind of opposite of a slippery slope. So as I said at the beginning, Chazal have very little to say about the Book of Maccabees story, but they have quite a bit to say about the Pinchas story. And it's not particularly flattering towards Pinchas. You would think that Pinchas is a good example of didn't he do the right thing? And the answer is begrudgingly, yes. But what the rabbis are very adamant about is the fact that he did the right thing does not make him somebody who we should hold up as an example. We should actually hold him up as in some way an exception. There are very few conditions when we want people to act like Pinchas. Think about that. It's a very tricky aspect of religious role modeling to say, I have an incredible role model of the person who actually obeys God's will, and I want to warn people lest they get a Pinchas complex. I don't want people walking around looking for opportunities to become Pinchas. Right? Because that's an incredibly dangerous,
God agrees with him after the fact.
God endorses him after the fact and says, which the rabbis play out, is the covenant that the reward that he's given is Brit Shalom.
Brit Shalom, yeah.
And what is it? There's a kind of, that's like God kind of maybe taking Pinchas down a little bit. What you need now is to calm down. You could imagine a religious personality like Pinchas saying, crushed it. Where's the next one? Put me on the front line. You could totally understand that this becomes something that you get very excited about. Look, I'm the one who obeys God's will. I'm the unthinking commander. I know what to do in these situations. Put me out there again. Brit Shalom is a way of saying, you did what you were supposed to do. Now find another career path. Do something else because we don't want you dead. So let's look at the Gemara on this that shows us how complicated the rabbis think the Pinchas story is. So the Mishnah starts, and we're in Sanhedrin. The Mishnah starts with a couple of kind of strange examples. One who steals a kisva or curses with a sorcerer. We're going to skip that on page 7-8, down top of 8. And then one who engages in intercourse with an Aramean woman. Person does this. They're looking for cases that kind of operate outside of the realm of traditional law. Things that are prohibited, but not really legally prohibited. This is a great problem for any court system. Things that are bad, but they're not expressly forbidden. And the rabbis say, in those situations, zealots strike that person. Meaning, somebody, vigilantes should take care of it. Right? We'll see more about this. There's this like weird dance around, we wish that someone would come fix this problem, but we don't think that we have the legal capacity to actually deal with it. So now go to Rav Chisda's line after a paragraph. What happens if somebody comes to consult the Beit Din? They see something like this is happening, and they come ask for instructions. You see where I am in the middle of page 8? Rav Chisda says, concerning one who consults, the court doesn't instruct him. It was also stated, the Rabbi Bar Chana said, and Rabbi Yochanan said, the same thing. One who comes to ask the Beit Din, what do I do in this situation? Zimri's over there having sex with a Midianite woman, an Aramean woman. Should I get my spear? Beit Din does not give any instructions, right? Because it's only permitted to vigilantes. And then the rabbi says something incredible. Moreover, if Zimri had separated himself and then Pinchas killed him, Pinchas would have been executed for killing him. So, in other words, it was great that he got that spear exactly right while they were having sex, while they were committing the act. But had Zimri simply separated, in that instance, it stops being an available moment for the possibility of violence. You get one shot, and if you miss that window of time, you are now a vigilante in the bad sense of the word. You've done something that we have not permitted you to do, and your act of violence is no longer can be construed as in any way self-defense, and has to be now described as a prohibited act of violence. If Zimri would have turned and killed Pinchas, he would not have been executed because Pinchas was a rodef. Pinchas was a person trying to kill him, and so therefore Zimri would have been legitimated from a place of self-defense. And this is why I love the Talmud. This is wild. They're inventing a scenario that doesn't exist in the Torah, right? In order to undermine some of the power of the very clear story that the Torah has already taught us. The very clear story the Torah has taught us was that Pinchas did the right thing, obeyed God's will, used violence in an appropriate way to stop the plague, and was rewarded for it. And the rabbis instead are coming along and saying, okay, fine, that may be, but had there been any slight deviation or variation in one way or another, Pinchas is a murderer. And what that then puts as huge constraints, it's not just try not to be a Pinchas in the world. Now it's, why would you ever want to be like Pinchas? If you have slightly worse timing or slightly worse aim, you are a murderer. Now Pinchas is not a model or an exemplar of who we're supposed to be. He's almost like a cautionary tale. You better have the fortune of the timing that Pinchas had. In fact, it even goes down, there's a lot more in this text that we could do, and I gave you the whole Gemara, but I'll show you one other place where it goes even further. On the bottom of page 8, well, we'll skip that part, it's wild, but we'll skip that part. Go on to the middle of page 8. Page 9, rather, sorry. Go to the next page. He rose, now they're quoting from the verses again. He rose from amidst the assembly, Vayakam mitoch ha'edah, vayikach romach biyadav, and he took a spear in his hand. And here, just as a throwaway line, the rabbis tell you a lot in this throwaway line of what they think about violence. From here we learn that one does not enter the Beit Midrash with a weapon. Why? Because Vayakam mitoch ha'edah, he leaves from the Edah, and then he gets a weapon. And the point is, therefore, so this is again like a little shtuch. You think that this has lessons for a person who sees themselves as a Ben Torah? We construct a world of Torah in which you're never allowed to actually bring a weapon into the Beit Midrash. I have studied in Batei Midrash with weapons. I don't know if you have. When I studied for 2 years in Yeshivat Har Etzion in the Gush, it is a very armed environment. It has to be, right? But there's also something odd about that thing. I remember there was one time when there was a drill, And there's always 6 students in the yeshiva who carry Uzis around just to have. And in the midst of one of these drills, somebody dropped their gun. And the whole place is silent, and then you hear this incredibly loud sound of a machine gun hitting stone floors. And I'm not going to say I'm so pious that I thought about this Gemara, but when I did learn this Gemara later, I was like, oh, there is supposed to be a dichotomy between the world of Torah and the world of weaponry. And so we're forced into environments in which we can't preserve that dichotomy. But right in the middle of this story about Pinchas, the rabbis are sticking in this other thing. Not only is Pinchas not great precedent, but there's something not Torah-like at all about a person who would hold a weapon. And then finally, at the bottom of page 9, the rabbis go on to say there are 6 miracles were performed for Pinchas. One, that Zimri should have separated himself and didn't, right? Then he would have been a murderer had he killed him. Another, that he should have spoken and he did not speak. A third, that he directed the spear to the male genitals of Zimri and the female genitals of Cosby. That made it like perfect. Then it was a real destruction of the act. One, that they didn't fall off of the spear. Remember, he carries them out with the spear that fulfills what would happen if they fell off? That's like a little bit of a weird fantasy that the rabbis have here. Another, that the angel came and lifted up the doorway of the Mishkan so that Pinchas could cut out. Again, wouldn't have thought about that. And another, that the angel came and caused destruction. The broad takeaway I have from this story, especially given that this is the text that the Maccabim are using as their ur text, as the text that's shaping the story for the Maccabean rebellion, is that the rabbis want to see this as a cautionary tale. They want to look at the story of Pinchas and say, okay, there may have been unbelievable circumstances. It was a 1 in a million shot, right? And because it was that, it was okay. Under any set of other circumstances, Pinchas is actually the one committing the violent act. And therefore, we as the sages are setting up that the paradigm that we have for violence is one in which we would say, at best, exercise extreme caution. If you are certain that you're in a situation of self-defense, you can't be characterized as a murderer. The rabbis are basically saying, be really careful about whether or not you can establish with that sense of certainty that you are acting legitimately in self-defense. This, as we know, is a major feature of the legal department of the IDF. This is the commitment to the legal department of the IDF. I have colleagues in Israel who have worked in the legal department of the IDF, and to their credit, they've oftentimes described to me moments when in the middle of a battle, they will get a phone call with a battle raging now, and as we know, most of the battles that take place are now street-to-street combat, so decisions that are made by soldiers oftentimes have to be made in real time at all levels of the hierarchy, which is a terrible way to ethically run a war. It's much easier when the top level of the hierarchy makes the most difficult ethical decisions. It's very difficult when individuals down that trajectory have to make those decisions. And my colleagues have described being called and asked, am I allowed to use this size shell in responding to this type of threat? Because this size shell is going to have a different type of consequence potentially for surrounding buildings, but it will guarantee that the job gets done. That feels very much in the spirit of this text. There has to be an awareness that even the moment of self-defense doesn't license you to effectively become a monster. And so much so that the gap between acting in self-defense or becoming a monster is not all the way over there. It's right over here. Questions or comments so far, and then we'll do a couple other pieces of topic. Go ahead.
The conditions around the action reminds me of the rabbi's reaction to the commandment of what to do to the son who is very new to his parents.
That's right.
And they make it almost impossible.
We don't want it. It's bad material, right? And you know why, right? Some of the things that feel like they're very obvious moral lessons get so easily taken out of context and moved to this far direction. Now, in that example too, like this one, would it have been enough for the rabbis to say, Pinchas was exceptional, try not to be like Pinchas? I don't think the rabbis think that's enough. I I think that there's a much larger claim being made here about the risks associated with the type of person who would do exactly what Pinchas did, which is have a violent instinct. That's what they're really scared of. What makes Pinchas incredible is that his obedience seems to make it very easy for him to pick up this spear and do something, and that mindset, that consciousness is actually a little bit frightening. Mr. Jovan, go ahead.
Do you have any other examples in history where people referred to, so basically themselves in the tradition of Pinchas? So seeing themselves like the Maccabim, I would just wonder in other generations of Bar Kokhba.
I don't know if Bar Kokhba refers to himself as Pinchas. It's very rare for people to use the tradition of Pinchas. It's very, very rare. Do you have an example?
Yeah, Eliyahu. Pinchas who Eliyahu.
Eliyahu is Pinchas.
So how do Chazal look at Eliyahu? Now the question.
Oh, now I gotta do some homework. But yes, that's a good one. Right. Eliyahu is a good example as well. Another hand, yeah.
Yes, you mentioned at the beginning that God has told Moshe what to do. And then we have this Gemara or Midrash where Moshe and Aaron were sitting and crying because they didn't know what to do. So how does this...
How do we make sense of that? Maybe Chazal are actually looking out for Moshe and Aaron in the sense that the pshat of the text is that they panic. And by making Pinchas's actions so exceptional, it helps us bail out Moshe and Aaron a little bit. It's not that they really failed, it's that this only a really unusual person would have the presence of mind and the good luck to not only do this in the moment, but to get it exactly right. Did you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit difficult. Like, to go to war as Jew is very difficult. There's like also even more constrictions on go as people to war. But now you have a direct command to don't do that. And I think it's difficult as well. I mean, you actually more or less instruct still the leadership of another people as well, but then later on when we want to establish how can we defend ourselves by going to war actively, it's really prohibited completely.
Listen, there's a larger problem that the Jewish people have around the ethics of war since the creation of the State of Israel, which is there are a lot of different choices you can make from within the canonical Jewish tradition of which stories are we meant to inherit and which stories are we meant to reject. So for instance, if you took as your primary text for the IDF the book of Joshua, God help us. And there are people who do that, who want to make that argument. There was a senior officer leading the Givati troop into Gaza in 2014, who, in leading his troops into Gaza, gave them a speech in which he referred to the battle in Gaza as a Milchemet Hashem. By the way, if that was in Arabic, we know what that's called. Jihad. He referred to it as a Milchemet Hashem. To the credit of the IDF, they removed him from his post. But he's not, is he wrong in the sense of, could I take pieces out of Jewish tradition and use it for a Jewish state, as an anchor for a Jewish state? He's not wrong. All of these are interpretive choices. Chazal, this kind of text, not that useful for an army. What would it mean if this was your text? Your text said, when you're going to face the enemy, if you don't get it exactly right at the time when a person is committing an act of terror, you are a murderer, and there's Din Rodef that allows you. Not great, not that useful. So there's some dance that has to take place between what do I actually need in order to fight a battle, and what is the moral vocabulary that I need to feel whole. And I guess Chazal against the Torah in this context is pushing pretty hard in one direction. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just thinking about Moshe and the way he reacted, and when he killed the Egyptian slave, he kind of more or less acted in a similar way. Right on the spot, he decided to do this action, and then he was reminded by the Jewish slave, you know, are you going to kill me
You're
too?
gonna kill the rest of us.
And then he has to leave and escape. So it could be that he was tempered by this kind of thinking of impulsive behavior.
I love that. That would be a good argument for why does he panic in this moment. It's because he's
Yeah,
seen
that's
that
what
moment.
I was thinking.
That's
that-
beautiful. I love that.
yeah.
I wish the Gemara had it. But it's right. Maybe Moshe has just learned not to be that person anymore. Maybe, and right now, that's to his detriment, right? Because he couldn't actually be that person anymore. There's a couple of other examples from the Gemara which suggest that this is not unique to the Pinchas story, but reflects a larger ideology around violence that makes the rabbis very skittish and skeptical about it. So if you look at this next piece of Gemara on page 10, I can't get over this little story. Shimon ben Shetach said, I will not see the consolation of Israel. That's a way of swearing, right? Like, it's not on my mother's life, or I swear I will not see the rebuilding of the temple. But this really, in other words, this really happened. If I did not see a person who was running after another person into a ruin, and the value of the ruin is to suggest an empty place, right? That there's no other way that there could have been other people hanging around there. So one person is running after the other one, and I ran after him, wanted to see what was going on, and I found he's holding a sword in his hand with blood dripping off of it, and the other person is lying on the floor convulsing. So what happened? He killed him. However, I said to him, wicked one, who killed this person? It's either me or you. Those are our two options. But what can I do, as your blood is not given in my control? And the Torah says, only out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall he that is to die be put to death. So this is a play on powerlessness. In order to have a judicial system, I have to abide by the rules of the judicial system, even when I know that someone who has committed a terrible act of violence is going to get exonerated for it. What am I going to do? It's either I killed this person or you killed this person, but what I can't tolerate, right, is either taking it into my own hands, right, or allowing the system of justice that I've designed to have exceptions for situations in which I know I'm right. That's the limit. That's the constraint that the Torah wants to put into the story. And then the rabbis finish the story in a way that makes us feel much better about it. It says, rather, God will exact retribution from you. Who ultimately is going to be responsible for payback? It's God. The sages said, they didn't move from that place until a snake came and bit him and he died. That's like a nice way to finish the story. Don't worry, he's not still out there. Don't worry, God was listening. Right? It's an act. That line is like an act of faith. Ultimately, the commitment to a kind of resistance against vigilante violence. That commitment will ultimately be rewarded. But if you want to read that last line a little darker, it might not be rewarded. This might not always happen. And all you'll have going for you is that you are a people who decided not to be governed by vigilante violence. That's who you have decided to be. It means that sometimes the bad guy will get away with it. Sometimes you won't actually see justice take place in your own lifetime, but you will have to feel that in some larger sense, that's the world that God wants. The last Gemara on violence that I want to look at, and then we'll finish with something on Hanukkah to bring it back to where we started. Go ahead.
But there is an exception, even in design of the judicial system, if you look at the Goel Hadam. That is an exception. You're actually allowing people to take the law into their own hands. Yes, the Torah makes certain has a design on what to do with these people and to prevent it from happening, but it's actually part of the system.
It's in the system. The rabbis don't like that either. Rabbis are going to find ways to make it very, very difficult for people to carry out on their own. Right? So you're right. In the Torah itself, like I said before, allows for a lot. The Torah itself is much more comfortable with violence. Pinchas's example is exceptional, but it's not crazy. The rabbis turn it from being exceptional into like an extreme level and an anomaly, and they'll do the same thing about Ben Sorer or Moreh, and they'll do the same thing about Goel Hadam. So the last text on violence I want to look at brings us closer back to the Mikdash and to the Mishkan, and it's the rabbis describing a moment of violence that is said to have taken place during the Second Temple period. And it helps to illustrate that the anxiety that the rabbis have around violence is not limited to stuff that takes place out there, but is especially sensitive when it relates to the altar. And I can't hear the Maccabee story without hearing this story as well. The sages taught an incident occurred, and we're on page 11. Two priests who were equal as they were running and ascending the ramp. Shneim Shavim. What happens is that there's an extensive hierarchy among the Kohanim about which of the temple practices who gets to do what. You need a good system. So, if you're the top level Kohen, I don't know what you get. You probably get some blood sprinklings on Yom Kippur. But if you're a low level priest, maybe you get clear off the Korban Olah from Shabbos Mincha, whatever it is. So these the guys are equal. So they have equal access to whatever has now been assigned. And so they were running, basically racing to ascend the ramp. One of the things I like when I hear a text like this is these were probably young people. These were probably young teenagers. As a parent of teenagers, I can identify with this story. One of them reached the 4 cubits, right, the top of the altar before his colleague, took a knife and stabbed him in the heart. Now this is the worst betrayal of the altar that can be imagined, right? Because this is not sacrifice of the sacrifices, this is sacrifice of a person. Of course, we skipped the most famous text in Jewish tradition about the attempt to sacrifice a person on the altar, which is Akedah Yitzchak, but it's hard to not hear that also lurking behind the surface. And that question of, are we supposed to learn from that text that Abraham really would have sacrificed his son? Or are we supposed to learn from that text of, are you kidding? One never would imagine that God would actually make that sacrifice. Rabbi Tzadok stood up on the steps of the entrance hall and said, "Hear, my brothers, the house of Israel." The verse states, and it quotes from the book of Deuteronomy, when you have a dead body lying between 2 towns, right, and you don't know who committed the murder, the claim that the Torah makes is that when you have that situation, you could just say, well, I guess none of us is responsible. But the more important message is to make everybody responsible. So the sacrifice falls on whichever town was closer has to take collective responsibility for a dead person in their midst. The larger moral lesson being, any society that tolerates a killing, a wanton killing in their midst, has something deeply, deeply broken in their society. And instead of saying, well, it's just crime, you actually interrogate inwards. That's the Bible's lesson. Rabbi Tzadok does this about the temple. If the temple is the type of place where 2 priests are competing with one another and actually commit an act of violence, right? On whom is the heifer to be broken? On the city or in the temple courtyards? The entire assembly burst into tears. This is on us. We have committed this crime between one Kohen and another. It gets worse. The father of the boy came and found he was still convulsing. He said, "May my son's death be an atonement for you." He's still convulsing, but the knife, since he's still alive, the knife hasn't been mekabel tumah. It hasn't required ritual impurity. This is an obscene comment, right? The father's primary concern is about the temple vessel more than his son who's lying bleeding out on the floor. This comes to teach you that the ritual of the purity of utensils was of more concern to them than the shedding of blood. So another element of this rabbinic resistance around violence becomes domesticated into the temple itself. A fear that in this context where this is supposed to be the place that actually exonerates us from wrongdoing, has actually attracted a culture of competitive violence, so much so that people can separate between the purity of the temple vessels and the actual act of violence. The last text I want to consider is the story of Hanukkah itself. The first part we all know. This is what the only thing the rabbis say about Hanukkah on the 25th day of Kislev. You can't eulogize or fast on them. When the Greeks came into the sanctuary, they defiled the oils. When they overcame and emerged victorious over them, no description of what that entailed, 1 cruse of oil, etc. But I want to look at the second part, which comes next, because I think it's a loaded little drasha here. We learn there from Hanukkah that a spark that emerges from under a hammer and went out and caused damage, the one who struck the hammer is liable. If I'm hammering away and a spark comes out from my hammering, I'm not doing anything wrong, right? but a spark accidentally comes out from my hammer, I am liable for whatever damages I caused by hammering away. A camel is laden with flax, right, and passes through the public domain, and its flax goes into a storefront, catches fire, right, and set fire to the building. The camel owner is liable. What's this about? Any guesses? Why have I shifted, learning from that story, to now talking about who's liable, about when a hammer strikes something and a spark goes out, or when a camel is walking through the market with way too much flax and brushes into a store, catches fire there, and then the camel owner is liable? What's that? What do we think is going on here? This is about Hanukkah. Yeah.
If you use self-defense, you cannot become a violent leader yourself and a violent regime, but you have to sort of come back like in class, basically.
It kind of does seem like this is about violence in some way. It kind of suggests to me that Hanukkah is flammable. Flammable. The holiday of Hanukkah is flammable, or it's inflammatory, right? This is the striking of the hammer. By the way, who's known as the hammer? Maccabee. The rabbis do talk about the Maccabee. This is flammable. So was it wrong for the Maccabees to do what they needed to do, hammering at what they needed to do? Well, no, it got us Hanukkah. That's what we had a few lines before. But is it possible that in that hammering, other sparks got out, which caused damage? Yeah, that's possible. Is it possible that when we put our fire out into the world, that sometimes it catches fire to other things that are unintended? Is it possible that a story that is about inflammation, as connects to not just flames, but political violence, could turn into something that it's not supposed to do? It's hard. When I was like, this, you read the first half, you're like, I guess the rabbis are finished talking about Hanukkah. You're like, this is what they really want to say about Hanukkah. Go ahead, yes.
Is there some reflection? I mean, obviously the timing of the commentary is always very interesting because of the temple's gone and now you're sort of looking backwards. And the Hasmonean dynasty started, let's say, with good intentions, and then deteriorated.
It's pretty bad, pretty
badly. Where then we learned that at the end you had the priesthoods being sold off, and people had to be told what to say, etc. on Yom Kippur. And is that a commentary on that as well? Looking back and saying, well, it started with good intentions, but actually it didn't work out well in the end.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a larger political lesson that we get from Chazal that's not just anti-Hasmonean, but anti the rebellion against Rome. Right? The rabbis become, over time, really, really skeptical about forms of Jewish political nationalism that are not just failed, but implausible. And they really feel that something has been corroded in the Jewish spirit by the belief that this time we're going to be able to do it. And noticing that in all of these different wars against the Romans, in both wars against the Romans and against the Seleucid Greeks here as well, one of the phases of those wars is intra-Jewish violence. What are we willing to do to one another to get those people on the bus? It's an inevitable consequence of that feeling of self-defense doesn't just legitimate you to do what you need to do against the one who's directly oppressing you. It makes you feel that anyone else who is not coming to your defense is complicit. And so, this is retrospective. I'm sure it's retrospective. And they're looking back and saying, something about this holiday makes us anxious. And I don't know, there's a part of me that also wants to kind of notice that and listen to it. I gave you an article to read at another time from Moshe Halbertal, who flags that one of the ironies of holiness is that things that are holy are supposed to, by definition, be the thing you don't control. Humans, in our tradition, the holy space is by definition something you're not in charge of. Holy land is holy because it's God's. But one of the natural human impulses is that things that we consider to be very holy, we try to keep control of. And once you do that, you are trafficking in not only violence and control, but you're trafficking in belief, that violence is in service of something transcendent. Halbertal writes this in the wake of the Rabin assassination, as a moment like, we have lost the ability to differentiate between violence that is supposed to be the stuff that enables us to survive in moments of vulnerability, to noticing the way that violence becomes corrosive, that you can move from what is the violence I need to do to survive against the real enemies, to things like the massacre by one priest of another priest in the temple. So I want to think with this and leave with this as our message around Hanukkah. This is a complicated kind of set of texts. You know, the good news is Jewish tradition leaves behind the Book of Maccabees. You can leave tonight and be like, thank goodness it's not in our canon. I think, though, that the reason I think the Book of Maccabees is still around. I think it's in part because it channels so many other stories like Moshe and like Pinchas. I think because it's tempting as Jews who feel in our own time legitimately like we are once again living in Jewish history through Yom Yerushalayim and Yom Ha'atzmaut, these holidays that involve the recapturing of the vocabulary of Jewish nationalism and Jewish sovereignty. It's an invitation back into the same kind of stories. I just want to hold that together with Chazal's warnings, Chazal's concerns. To name, it's great to celebrate Hanukkah if, like Pinchas, it was the moment where for a brief time we got it just right. For a brief time we got it just right. And then to take it with Chazal's concern, don't let that necessary violence you needed to do in order to survive in a particular moment, never let that to actually become an ideology itself. Thanks, everybody.
Good.